B for birdie. Off you go.
Just before midnight on the 13th of September 1942, 6 Wellington bombers took off from RAF Edgehill. They were part of a massive retaliatory raid on Bremen, but for the rookie crew of B for Bertie, it was only their second operational mission. And for Tail End Charlie, Sgt Bob Plowright, in the rear gun turret, it was also the eve of his 4th wedding anniversary. And at 34 years of age, he was the oldest of those on board.
Bomb doors open. Emperor Mother landed 0426. Still no sign of B for Bertie. Over.
Hello, group. Yes, they're all back now, except B for Bertie.
And as the sun rose on that autumn morning 80 years ago, B for Bertie, with its crew of 6, was still missing. Just another one of so many wartime missions that ended with death and a name on a village war memorial. This is the story of rear gunner Sgt Bob Plowright. And although we've given away the end, it does have a start and a middle that are full of surprises, including where he grew up and the identity of his mysterious wife. Bob Plowright had joined the RAF in 1938, about the same time as he married a woman who immediately disappeared from his life. We know quite a bit from the documents that we've seen, but photos have been almost impossible to find. So we've had to use images from newspapers and cinema films to illustrate this story of a man who wasn't really a local, although he was able to give Longstone Hall as his home address. But to understand how that came about, we need to go back a couple of generations to a certain James Oliver Plowright, who came from Nottingham. Of James's 4 sons, Bob's grandfather John was the odd one out. He was the one who didn't go into partnership to form Plowright Brothers, mining engineers of Chesterfield, back in 1878. But in 1907 the family was brought back together again when John's son James married his cousin Elizabeth, who was the daughter of one of the Chesterfield Plowrights. And it was her brother Robert who became managing director of the family firm and moved into Longstone Hall in 1935. Which is why Bob Plowright was able to give Longstone Hall as his address when he joined the RAF. Today, Robert Stewart Crichton Plowright rests in peace in grave number 87 in this private cemetery on the Dutch island of Schiermonnikoog, alongside other sailors and airmen whose bodies were washed ashore during both World Wars. He was buried by the occupying Germans in September 1942, and every year there's a service of remembrance attended by locals and visitors to this popular holiday island. But unlike many of the other graves, number 87 didn't have a photo. So in 2016, the man who organises the services, Jan Gruendijk, got in touch with the Longstone Local History Group to see if we could help, because Sgt Plowright was assumed to have been a local Longstone man. But, as we now know, he wasn't the Robert Plowright who lived in the hall, but rather his namesake nephew, who, it turns out, was born in May 1908 in rural Edwardian Surrey. Chobham, to be precise. But by the time Bob's little sister, Elizabeth Catherine, Betty, came along in 1911, they'd moved to Sutton, where they were closer to his mum's 3 younger sisters, Margaret, Mary and Helen, all of whom played parts in Bob's story, starting with Helen, who gave Bob a starring role in her wedding ceremony in 1914. The Derbyshire Times reports that 6-year-old Bob was dressed in a blue and white pageboy outfit, and that there were 2 family members missing from the congregation. Helen's sister Mary was mysteriously ill on the big day, and Bob's father James, who, having been a global commercial traveller, had in 1914 settled in Argentina, where he was running a factory. But, understandably, Bob, Betty and their mum didn't travel out to join him until after the First World War, when they all took up residence in Buenos Aires, no doubt enjoying the affluent lifestyle of colonial expats, which included being able to shop and take afternoon tea in that city's branch of Harrods. Perhaps that was one of the perks that encouraged Mary, who by then was Bob's one remaining unmarried aunt, to travel out to Argentina and try her luck, but after a couple of years she returned to London. However, Bob and his family remained in Buenos Aires, where he was educated, first at the Belgrano Day School and then at St George's College, a prestigious boarding school for the sons of English-speaking expats, which he attended from 1923. So he's in this photo, but we just don't know where. Today, 90% of the pupils are Argentine, and the school is now co-educational, but it's still as highly regarded in academic and sporting fields as it was back in Bob's day, when the school magazine tells us that in his final year he was second top of his class, as well as being rather fleet of foot. And this is the cup that he won in 1926 for the 100-yard sprint. And it's still highly prized within the family. He sang bass in the choir, and he served as a sacristan in the school chapel. And along with many other old boys who mostly also joined the RAF, he's forever remembered on the school's Roll of Honour.
This is London calling the British Isles. A crisis. All efforts at compromise between the Trade Union Council and the government have failed.
In 1926, the year of the general strike, Bob, who was then 18, travelled to England, not to volunteer to drive buses, but to continue his education. Now, we don't know whether it was something academic at a university or a practical course, although we suspect that it was probably the latter, and that it might have involved horses, because family legend has it that when he returned to Argentina in 1929, he became a gaucho. Well, that's how his sister Betty remembered this episode in Bob's life, but we find it hard to believe that he was attracted to a career in cattle rearing. Much more likely, we think, is that he was involved in the gaucho sport of polo, which was also popular amongst the wealthy and expat communities. And if that were the case, it would tie in with Betty's other story that Bob spent some time in Shanghai, because polo was big there in the early 1930s. And a young man from Bob's background could well have been involved in the business side of the sport, namely buying and selling ponies. Now, if that were the case, it would explain why we haven't been able to find any trace of Bob back here in England until the mid-1930s, when this electoral register shows that he owned the business at number 34, which was an equitation stables on the ground floor of this red brick property over there in this mews in Kensington. Meanwhile, in 1930, Bob's parents returned to England on board the Royal Mail ship Asturias, which, as well as carrying mail, had refrigerated holds for Argentine beef and first-class accommodation for passengers, although there would also have been a bit of a chill in the Plowright cabin, because when the ship arrived at Southampton, Bob's parents split up and went their separate ways. Dad going to Ashridge, a large house which he had bought just outside Winchester, where he pursued his interest in the subject of spiritualism. Whereas Mum gravitated to her side of the Plowright family, especially her sister Mary, who was still single and living in London, and her brother Robert, the one who moved to Longstone Hall, where, as the only brother of a bevy of sisters, he continued to host family gatherings. And it was probably thanks to these house parties that Bob got to know his third aunt, Margaret's family. She had married into the army with connections to military intelligence and the Foreign Office. And it seems that that's how Bob would have heard about what was really happening in fascist Germany. The plight of Jews and other minorities must have really touched a chord with him and his rather privileged lifestyle, running the Kensington Equitation Stables. And it's this publicity photo in an article about polo that makes us think that Bob must have at least still had a journalistic connection with the sport, because the picture was taken in Rotten Row, where his stable's bread and butter business was the hiring out of hacks for people to go riding in Hyde Park. Meanwhile, in Europe, Hitler's troops were riding into Austria to claim it as part of a German-speaking homeland. And since Hitler himself was an Austrian, it wasn't surprising that almost half of the country supported this Anschluss as a way of bringing Austria's depressed economy up to that of Germany's. However, the other half of the population saw it simply as an invasion by a Nazi dictatorship. Lotte Hahn, who lived in Vienna, was a multilingual, blue-stocking Jewish journalist, so naturally she was one of that second group. She managed to escape to London, where she was able to get in contact with Eugene Lenhoff, a newspaper editor, Freemason, and a political activist who she would have known from back in Vienna. He was involved in helping refugees like Lotte to get to the New World, where they could help to counter a growing tide of Nazi propaganda. And because she also spoke French and English, Lotte was earmarked to go to Canada with a British passport acquired by a marriage of convenience. Organised, it appears, with the help of a junior diplomat from one of the shadier departments in the Foreign Office. That summer's newsreels show a nation preparing for war. London was digging air raid shelters, and its residents were being issued
with gas masks, with men joining the forces.
And in this frenzied atmosphere,
And then Munich.
leading up to the Munich crisis, Bob decided to do his bit by not only enlisting in the RAF, but also by marrying Lotte so that she could quickly leave for Canada as Mrs. Charlotte Plowright, a British passport holder. Now, normally it wouldn't be advisable to help a refugee in that way, because marriages of convenience were a red rag to John Bull and the other like-minded papers which were violently opposed to the idea that a foreign woman could buy British citizenship. But in this case, it looks like Bob and Lotte were being minded by elements within the establishment who took advantage of that summer's war fever to persuade Bob to do what he did. The witnesses, Lenhoff, who would have known Lotte, and Barker Benfield, the man from the Foreign Office who I suspect guided Bob through the whole process, would have picked Edmonton Register Office because it was far away from Bob's home turf in Kensington. After the ceremony, Charlotte moved to the Fonthill Hotel in Reigate, where she could lie low whilst waiting for her new passport. And as far as we know, she never saw Bob again. And from this newspaper article, you'd think that she'd also forgotten his Christian name. But this fascinatingly half-accurate story, which appeared a couple of days before Lotte sailed for Montreal, was probably planted to make it look like her marriage, and thus her new passport, were completely legitimate. For Bob, however, it was important that he couldn't easily be linked to the marriage ceremony. So, the Robert Plowright, who was the owner of riding stables and lived at 101 St Leonard's Road in Fulham, was apparently not the Robert Plowright who joined the RAF, because he lived at Longstone Hall and had previously been a self-employed advertising clerk. whilst the apparently unconnected Robert Plowright, who married Lottie Hahn, was a journalist living in Kensington. All those discrepancies were half-truths rather than lies, but they allowed Bob to keep the marriage secret from his parents, his sister, and initially from the RAF. However, his Aunt Margaret's family did know. So they must have heard through their Foreign Office contacts, or even from Barker Benfield himself. Bob joined the RAF as a medical orderly, so he must have been able to show them that he had some aptitude in that field. And because his mother, sister and Aunt Mary, with whom he shared the house in Fulham, had been offered accommodation in Great Longstone by Uncle Robert, where they would be well away from the war-frenzied capital, Bob could legitimately give Longstone Hall as his address. Meanwhile, Charlotte received her ticket to Montreal, but it was on a tramp steamer operating from a Welsh dock that mostly handled coal and timber rather than passengers. We know that when she got to Canada, she did some freelance work for the Toronto Star, and she also worked for Alex Valentine, a comic book publisher whose politics were known to be left-wing. And during the war, she did translation work for Canadian military intelligence. Bob's war service started at the RAF's Central Medical Base at Padgate near Warrington, where he would have continued his own medical training, as well as no doubt helping with health checks and inoculations for newly conscripted recruits before they too went off to become part of the war effort. Bob's ongoing nursing training would have made him increasingly aware of his Aunt Helen's failing health. Now, back in 1914, it was at her wedding to Thomas Smiley, a man of the cloth, that Bob had been dressed up as a page boy. And just recently, we found this photo, which shows Helen with her fiancé and her two sisters when they were all in their 20s and in the full bloom of health. But by the late 1930s, when Thomas was rector of Christ Church in Southwark, the records show that he was employing a home help to run the rectory because by then Helen was becoming incapacitated with rheumatoid arthritis. Before long, she was in need of residential care, which would have been beyond the means of a lowly rector's stipend. So, just about the start of the war, her brother Robert arranged for her to come here to Sheffield to a nursing home that was right next door to the Royal Hallamshire. But inevitably, she continued to deteriorate. And when Helen died in September 1940, she was buried here at St Thomas's Church in Chesterfield in the Plowright plot in the graveyard at the rear of the church. Nowadays, this area is a bit of a jungle, and the Plowright headstone, which I think used to be just about here, has vanished from sight, just like the family itself. But in 1940, all this area was what you would call Plowright territory. Indeed, the factory was only just down Chatsworth Road, just the other side of where Morrison's now is. Bob, of course, was stationed at Warrington, which was only 2 hours away, so he could well have attended the funeral, but the date would have haunted him because it was September the 14th, exactly 2 years to the day after his secret wedding. Back in Great Longstone, Bob's mother, his sister Betty and Aunt Mary had moved into one of the new bungalows that Uncle Robert had built at the bottom of Moor Road. Betty was working as a land girl, and in December 1940 she received a special badge from the Duchess of Devonshire to mark her first 12 months of service, although rather than working with cattle, she's listed as having been a kennel maid. But before long she had more pressing family duties to attend to in Winchester, where she went to look after her ailing father, who died in May 1941, leaving his estate to her and her brother Bob. was it his dad's death, or was it that being a lowly ranked nursing orderly didn't feel like proper active service now that the war was hotting up? Well, certainly something must have persuaded Bob to make a bold move and apply to be transferred to Bomber Command. Being part of a bomber's crew meant promotion to the rank of sergeant and a job that was full of excitement, action and danger. And after several different courses to learn about the roles of observer, radio operator, bomb aimer and navigator, Bob was posted to the Air Gunner School near Inverness for slightly less than realistic moving target practice. But at least he would have known that at only 5'5.5" tall, he would easily be able to squeeze into a real Wellington bomber's rear gun turret when he joined Operational Training Unit number 21, based at Moreton-in-Marsh and Edgehill near Banbury. The trainee pilots, wireless operators, navigators and gunners apparently sorted themselves into groups of 6, and Bob finished up in Canadian pilot Michael Hollob's crew. After another 6 weeks of intensive operational training, their first real mission was on the 10th of September 1942, when they were one of the 476 bombers that raided Dusseldorf, and, more importantly, they were among the 446 of them that made it back. Three days later, Hollob and his crew set off on their second mission, this time another mass raid, but on a more northerly track towards Bremen. Their preparations completed, they departed Edgehill shortly before midnight and disappeared into the night, keeping radio silence so as not to alert the enemy that they were on their way. But of course, the Germans wouldn't have been in the dark for long because they had a string of radar stations along the Frisian coast. The dishes associated with this new technology had a range of roughly 20 miles, and Tiger Station, like all the others, had a control room with a lot of staff and equipment, all protected in an underground bunker. Even so, each area could only track 2 planes. One enemy bomber, the position of which was projected onto a map as a red spot, and a green one that showed the position of the German night fighter that was patrolling the area. The fighter pilot was in radio contact with the control room so that he could be directed towards the bomber until it was close enough for the pilot to actually see it in the night sky. Now, the British tactic to minimise the risk of being intercepted in this way was to fly out in tight formation so that all the bombers passed through the same radar control zone together and thus overwhelmed its capability. But when they returned to base, they were inevitably more scattered and easier to pick off. And that appears to be what happened when Michael Hollob's Wellington bomber, with Bob Plowright in the rear gun turret, flew into Control Area Tiger in the early hours of September the 14th. From then on, they really didn't stand a chance because the fighter that was sent after them was piloted by Captain Helmut Lent, who was not only one of Germany's night fighter aces, but also the commander of the local air base, so his plane would almost certainly be one of the few fitted with aerials for an on-board experimental short-range radar system, so that his radio operator, who was sat immediately behind him, could direct Lent to the target more accurately than Chinese whispers from the ground. Bob had been trained as an observer before he was taught gunnery, but without radar it would have been impossible to spot the ME-110 as it closed in on the Wellington at an altitude of some 10,000 feet, 10 kilometres northwest of the island of Terschelling. The bomber was shot down, and Bob was one of 3 of the crew whose bodies were later washed ashore along the Frisian coast. He died on his 4th wedding anniversary, unlucky September the 14th, and his last resting place is marked by a Commonwealth War Graves Commission headstone in the Peace Garden on Schiermonnikoog. It was a couple of months before the family could place this announcement in the Derbyshire Times. In it, there's no mention that Bob was married, which is one of the reasons why we think that his close family didn't know about his wife in Toronto. But by then, the RAF did have Charlotte's address, so they could have informed her that she was now a widow. Needless to say, there's no mention of Charlotte in Bob's will, which incidentally mentions very little in the way of his possessions, apart from a wish for his sister Betty to have his gold signet ring. In 1945, she, along with her mother and Aunt Mary, moved from Great Longstone to the White House in Baslow, whilst in Toronto we know that Charlotte returned to her freelance writing work because one of her CVs has amazingly been preserved in the Canadian National Archive. In 1952 she married Vincent O'Byrne, and in 1956 she died and was buried in the O'Byrne family plot in the city's Notre-Dame-des-Neiges cemetery, where her name is recorded as Charlotte Hahn O'Byrne. However, this is Baslow Churchyard, where there is a memorial inscription to a Mrs. Plowright. She was Bob's mother, and she died in 1952. Now that year was quite a year for Bob's sister Betty, because in spring she decided that she was going to emigrate and start a new life in New Zealand. Of course, no sooner had she got there, her mother became ill, and then Betty had to make the long sea voyage back again. And then, after the funeral in 1953, Betty set sail yet again, back to New Zealand to start a new life as a children's nurse. However, nothing came of it, because the following year, 1954, she was back on the high seas again, returning to England, where she finally settled in Golders Green. Somewhere with a bit more life than Baslow. However, her Aunt Mary did remain in Derbyshire, the county of her birth, until her death in 1962. Betty, however, was more at home in London, where until 1968 she lived next door to her other aunt, Margaret, so she got to know Margaret's granddaughter, Francine, who is, as far as we know, the only surviving member of the Plowright family who actually knew Betty, and through her knew of Bob. So Francine had been to Bob's grave on Shimonikoog Island, but she didn't know that he was also named on the War Memorial in Great Longstone, and as such he's part of a fading but resilient annual connection.
1939, 1945, Great Longstone.
With the village's not too distant past.
Robert Plowright, James Tim, John Waring. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. We will remember them.